Welcome to this penultimate seminar in the Interpretation Method Critique network. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I join you today from the lands of the Ngambri and Ngunnawal people and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Today, it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Matthew Norton at the University of Oregon, who works on the relationship between culture and state power. He'll be speaking to us today on piracy, punishment, and structural hermeneutic methods, which is part of a book project that's recently come out with University of Chicago Press. So with that, I'll pass it over to Matthew and say thanks for joining us.
Perfect. Thank you very much, April. Thanks, everyone, for giving me a chance to talk with you and to join the seminar for today. Just a tech check before. Everything look okay and sound okay? Great. Okay. Someone please let me know if not. So I want to start the talk today in Charleston in the province of South Carolina. It's on Thursday, October 30th, 1718. After a grand jury had returned an indictment for more than 30 men accused of piracy, the Attorney General of South Carolina, a fellow named Richard Elaine, who was an up-and-coming Charleston lawyer, addressed the trial jury. First, he talked to them for a little while about the nature of the crime of piracy, hitting a number of tropes and ideas that were very common throughout piracy trials, talking about pirates as beasts of the seas, as monsters preying on the good and the weak, talking about pirates as enemies of all humanity, and other ideas around those concepts. He then turns to a different topic and gives a gripping recollection of a traumatic event that had occurred in Charleston a few months ago. So here are the highlights of that I'll go over. So Elaine says, as part of his speech to the jury at the outset of the trial, what a grievous dilemma where I don't know, I have no idea what a 1718 Charleston, South Carolina accent would sound like, and so I'm not going to try to fake it. You know, I like to do accent work, but I'd rather not humiliate myself. So I'll just say it as I do. What a grievous dilemma were we ourselves reduced to in the month of May last, when Thatch, the pirate, also known as Blackbeard, the pirate, came and lay off this harbor with a ship of 40 guns and 140 men. And after having taken Mr. Samuel Wragg hostage, they plundered the vessels going home to England. And after that, they had the most unheard of impudence to send up one Richards and 2 or 3 more of the pirates with the said Mr. Marks with a message to the government demanding a chest of medicines of the value of 300 or 400 pounds and asking that they be sent back without offering any violence to them or otherwise. They would send in the heads of Mr. Wragg and all the prisoners they had on board. And Richards and 2 or 3 more of the pirates walked upon the bay and in our public streets to and fro in the face of all the people, waiting for the governor's answer. And the government were forced to yield to their demands, and they gave over this valuable chest, 400 pounds worth of medicines, over to the pirates, who then left Charleston behind. So it was this extremely humiliating event. Here, by the way, this is an engraving from the 1720s of Blackbeard the pirate, who was responsible for this raid on Charleston. One of the sort of fun things about Blackbeard and his sort of presentation, if you see the off to the sides of his hat, there's these smoking fuses, like a fuse to light off explosives. He used to tuck it in his hat and light the fuses during battle, supposedly, so that he would constantly be ringed in smoke and have a kind of ethereal and frightening appearance. But I'm just using this Blackbeard as a kind of token or as a symbol for what happened in Charleston. So, so here's the event in Charleston. It's not really a depiction of that, but it kind of gets the same idea of Blackbeard and his men taking this chest off the beach. So the scene we have then is Elaine, the Attorney General, giving a detailed description of Blackbeard's humiliation of Charleston in a trial for an entirely different act of piracy. The piracy that was on trial was not the event that I just described in Charleston. It was something much smaller and quite different. Um, so it raises the question, or at least it did for me, about why Elaine is talking at such length about this event that happened in Charleston during a trial of mostly different people for an entirely different crime. Why is he talking about it? And I kind of got stuck on this question as one of the examples I had while I was starting to do my research on piracy. And I came across this example, and just it occurred to me that it was a little bit interesting and odd, and in some ways, in trying to sort of think through this circle. Why is he talking? Why is he talking about that event in this time and place, a trial that was addressing an entirely different crime? I mean, in some ways, the answer was sort of obvious. He's trying to counteract this humiliating episode from Charleston's recent history. Elaine is trying to exact some measure of retribution for this collective trauma that was inflicted on the city. Um, However, it also, I think, invites a kind of comparison. If we're trying to think through further this, go back for a second, this question about why talk about that event in this time and place, it invites a kind of comparison between the two, because there are some very strikingly different features between what was going on in Charleston in May of 1718 and in October of 1718. So if we take these as two different times, in May, Blackbeard and his fleet exerted total control over the city of Charleston because of their capacity for violence and their demonstrated cruelty and even delight in using violence. They were reputed as a particularly bloodthirsty group of pirates. They were known for inflicting torture on many people who tried to defy them. They had Charleston entirely at their mercy. Their ship had 40 guns, at least 140 men, 4 small sloops, and there was no help. There was no naval presence in Charleston. The military presence was minimal, and Charleston was entirely without the capacity to resist the overwhelming violence that the pirates were able to inflict on them. So in that sense, Charleston was really cut off and isolated from any broader sources of support or help or an organized capacity for violence. So that's in May. In October, of course, the situation is very different. Blackbeard's fleet has broken up, and in fact, Blackbeard is not on trial for this event that Elaine is talking about. It's other people who, some of whom were part of that fleet, but others who weren't. So the fleet had disbanded. Many of the pirates that had participated had been captured and were being held in chains. There was naval support. There were troops that were available that had helped to capture some of these pirates. And the town of Charleston, the government, the state, had the clear upper hand as practitioners of violence. And so because of the contrast between the capacities for violence between these two times, the trial presented an opportunity to revisit the May attack and to impose what the people of Charleston saw as a more righteous morality onto that event, oriented toward state power and state categories. So the pirates were once these temporary sovereigns in a violent local social order where Charleston was forced to obey, pirates walking freely up and down the streets in this outright act of humiliation. Now the pirates are in the dock, forced to submit to the legal process and the violent retribution of the state. And so in thinking about this event and sort of trying to think through some of these questions, what this put me onto was this interplay between space and time. And I'll talk about the space parts in a second, but it put me onto this question about the relationship between space and time that ended up being one of the lenses that I use for thinking about and understanding piracy trials as a technology of social control. And it ends up being the kind of focal point for one of the chapters of the book. Isolation is one of the key characteristics of the crime of piracy. Throughout the contemporary literature on piracy, people are always noting the important fact that piracy occurs in isolated places, on the lonely high seas, on abandoned stretches of beach or ocean. It happens away from other aspects of state and other forms of social power. And so, in some ways, part of the horror of piracy for many contemporaries was that it emphasized this isolation, and it really represented the fact that the state cannot be everywhere. That was certainly not the case in the 17th and 18th century British Empire. It's also not the case now. The state isn't everywhere at all times. And so, what is someone, a state agent who's trying to advance state power, to advance a state monopoly or at least supremacy on the capacity to use violence? What are they to do when faced with a crime like piracy that specializes in occurring in places that are isolated? You have this dilemma of isolation versus this attempts to control violence through mechanisms of social control. And what I eventually ended up thinking about and focusing on was the creation, so thinking about piracy trials as the creation of a cultural system that was able to make the past present and available for authoritative adjudication. Right, so it's a kind of cultural technology that allows for people in a time and place to go back to the past and to represent it in the present to give it a kind of further meaning. So the trial as a sort of time travel device. Importantly, though, for my thinking about this question about time, space, and legal trials, the sort of time travel of the trial, at least as it relates to piracy, and I think more generally, also it goes in two directions. One direction is the people at the time of the trial, like Elaine, who's using symbols to represent the past as present, subject to adjudication under new circumstances of the capacity to use violence. So it shifts time in that way. But it also shifts time in a different direction. The trial also alters the temporality of pirate attacks. And this is something starting from the Elaine case and thinking about temporality, space, and piracy that I started to see in many other cases, where one of the successes of creating a regime of piracy trials was that it provided a future encounter with state agents and state categories as a likelihood of piracy attacks. So these attacks that would often happen in isolation and often would be undertaken without any clear expectation that there would be a future context of state-imposed categories and retribution. It attained that future when piracy trials became more effective, more common, more widespread, and therefore more likely. Right? So it provided a kind of future. And so the way I was thinking about this is that it made temporality an important cultural technology, state tool for trying to exert control over piracy, this crime that is particularly difficult because it happens in these isolated places. So the book talks about and thinks about how British imperial agents tried to create this interpretive system, this interpretive infrastructure that I call it, that altered the temporality of piracy and that shifted both the ability to go back in time to revisit crimes of piracy that happened in lonely and isolated places at times of greater state power and authority where state categories could be imposed with force and violence, and also that provided a future for piracy trials. Right? So for me, this is the kind of sorry, let me just check this. Yeah. So this is the kind of loop that I've just been describing, the kind of research loop that I went through, starting from this scene in the trial of Stede Bonnet. Just a kind of aside at the beginning of the trial where Elaine talks about this sort of situation that was very traumatic, but also was out of place and didn't really involve this trial in a direct way. And trying to puzzle over that eventually led me to thinking about the remaking of the temporalities of piracy in the early modern maritime world and how that was possible. What was necessary in order to create the, as I thought of them and think of them, the cultural technologies that made that possible. By using the single case to kind of start theorizing and thinking about some of those ideas, that then allowed me to return to a wide variety of other piracy trials. And I started to find some very similar and interesting dynamics when it came to temporality and how people use temporality both symbolically and in the ways in which temporality was altered for people engaged in piracy. And then to go beyond the trials, in doing the slides for my presentation, I only easily had pictures of trials, but in the book I go beyond trials to talk about other ways that this kind of altered temporality was it kind of spread throughout the culture of the early modern maritime world as part of the changing regime for the control of piracy. So I'll leave off on the sort of, the substantive argument, the historical argument for now, because it's a talk focused on methods. But the reason I start with that is because for me, it's an encapsulation of one of the loops that was very typical of the book. And as I was saying to April before the talk, while we were getting set up, this has been such a great opportunity to me to get ready for today's talk, because I really haven't had a chance to sort of step back and think through some of these methods. And while I was doing that for this talk, I noticed throughout the book that this sort of loop that I have here, I've just given one example of it, but I feel like that is, it's something that happened over and over again. And this kind of image can be used to characterize many of the arguments that I derived in the book, going from these individual cases or unique events to some kind of broader structural observation or theoretical observation, back to the interpretation and analysis of individual cases. Okay. Before I get into the structural hermeneutics part, just check in. Everything okay with voice, sound, everything good? Excellent. Okay, good. All right, so I'm a sociologist. Obviously, this is coming at it from a different perspective than some in the workshop. And so the way that I think about the methods that I use, the specific approach to interpretive methods, is structural hermeneutics. It's not a term I came up with. I'll talk about that in a moment. And as so many things in sociology, the starting point for where this comes from is in mid-century dominance of Talcott Parsons and Parsonian structural functionalism, and in the sort of reaction against that. And I won't go over all those details. They're recounted in many places, but the basic gist was Parsons went from tremendous dominance over theory and, in many cases, methods in American sociology to being rejected as conservative, as providing a model that was strongly reproductive of social structures, gave too much power to socialization, and so on. And part of the reaction against Parsons was a Marxist reaction. Thinking about conflict and change from a Marxist perspective was one way to respond to that. But one thing that resulted from that was through the sort of mid and later part of the 20th century in American sociology, culture took a kind of strange turn where culture ended up being subordinated in many cases to other kinds of economic and other social structural factors. Culture came to be seen as an outcome, not an independent variable of interest. And so it ended up being sidelined in many respects. Okay, so they're going over decades of social theory very quickly and probably not super accurately, but that's a kind of myth history of what happened. Jeffrey Alexander and Philip Smith responded to that in the 1990s and then around 2000 with what they call their strong program in cultural sociology, elements of a structural hermeneutics. And this can be found in a few places in the book that I provide the reference for there, but also at the website that's on the screen. Um, and for Alexander and Smith, they reject this turn away from culture. They suggest that culture is a complex, it's multiple, sometimes it's contradictory, and those are all important elements. So in their strong program in cultural sociology, which is something I see myself as working in, they adopt a few premises as it relates to culture and what culture is and how it works. One part of that is the relative autonomy of culture, basically the argument that we shouldn't think about culture as being dominated by economics or other more powerful social structural factors, but that culture is itself an autonomous aspect of social life that needs to be analyzed in its own terms. Sometimes this is also called the analytic autonomy of culture. So another part of their argument is that we need to think about culture as a cause and not just as an outcome of more real things like economic superstructure or sorry, economic structure or things like that. So we want to think about culture as a cause or part of sociological explanations. And these are, of course, much longer and deeper debates, but I just want to give the kind of highlights of them so that I can get to the more methodological part of what I want to be talking about. So the relative autonomy of culture piece is, as Alexander and Smith say, this is the most important thing about the strong program in structural hermeneutics. It's their defining claim. And therefore, obviously, I'm just going to skip over it entirely. It's also important for my book, but I'm just going to skip it because the things I think that were more interesting and relevant for thinking about here is the other part of their claim for structural hermeneutics, which is this idea that structural hermeneutics is a methodology that allows us to start to think about culture as a cause. So this is all from Alexander and Smith's essay on structural hermeneutics, where they talk about the importance of anchoring causality in proximate actors and agencies, specifying in detail how culture interferes with and directs what happens. Okay, they also talk about specifying the mechanisms through which webs of meaning or culture more broadly influence action. So the idea here is to try to find ways to think about culture in a broad, multivalent, complex, sophisticated way, and also to tie it very directly to causality by identifying it as part of sequences of concrete social action. Now, okay, so I was attracted to this idea as a graduate student. Jeff Alexander was my advisor, and you know, one of the nice things about working with him and wanting to work within this tradition is that the essay that I've been referencing so far, in my opinion, does a kind of loose job of defining what structural hermeneutics actually looks like. There was a lot of work to do to kind of spell out what how this actually worked as a method beyond a kind of set of theoretical observations. So what does it mean analytically? What do we look at when we're trying to think about culture as cause? What do we do with it? What interpretive method works to test and develop this theory of culture in social life? For the sake of time, I'll skip over this a little bit quickly here. We can. So what are we looking at? What do we do methodologically? One way we can specify culture. It's obviously a complicated term. It can mean lots of different things. I tend to think about it in the way that William Sewell talks about it as the semiotic dimension of human social practice. But again, this is a methods workshop. That's semiotic. That's fine. But what do we do? What do we look at? What are we actually getting into when we're looking at these things? Now, one way to think about that that has been suggested in the literature on structural hermeneutics is that we want to think about cultural structures. So symbols and symbolic systems. We want to think about broad narratives that exist within a particular social context or setting or within a particular group. We want to think about social scripts and roles, these more general cultural frameworks that people use and that people embody when they're engaging in social life. Semiotic codes, drawing from structuralism in anthropology and literary theory, and of course from linguistics as well, inspired by Saussure and others. right? And then institutions, which is part of, it's a big argument that I have in the book, but I put it in parentheses because I won't be talking about that today. But all of these kind of cultural, structural things, they are of importance to people like myself who do structural hermeneutics. But going back to that question of what do we look at, these aren't actually that great yet. They're not that helpful because these are pretty broad, pretty general things. And so it doesn't tell us immediately where do we go to look for a semiotic code. I mean, I can find specific instances maybe, but not the code itself. So here's another way to think about what we look at. This is a kind of different genre of answer to that question. We want to look at things like symbolic action, speech acts following John Austin, social performances following Austin, Judith Butler, and others. Look at interactions and situations. We want to look at interpretations and the way that people do interpretation in social life. So this is looking at concrete social meanings. So when we're trying to do a cultural sociology predicated on the autonomy and causality of culture, we've got two kind of broad sets of things we want to look at: social meanings on the one hand and cultural structures on the other hand. And what I've been trying to do across a number of articles and definitely in the book is to try to try to figure out, again, what it looks like methodologically and theoretically to work within this space of cultural meanings on the one hand and cultural structures on the other. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about these in any length. I've kind of written about them in different places. So in one article, Structural Hermeneutics of the O'Reilly Factor, which is about a right-wing television program, what I did is I spent more hours than I want to think watching right-wing news media and trying to develop an idea of the cultural codes that allow this television presenter to develop a conservative, right-wing, Republican, in the United States, Republican-aligned interpretation of basically everything that happened, right? He would be on for hours every night and consistently able to generate right-wing conservative interpretations. And so I develop an idea of the cultural code from that. And in order to develop that idea of code, of course, it involved watching hours and hours of the show to watch many of the specific meaning-making episodes that occurred. So that's kind of one version of that. A second article where, I don't know what I was thinking when I titled this one. It's called Mechanisms and Meaning Structures. I kind of buried the lead because it's about a pretty fun empirical case. I mean, fun for me to think about, not fun for the people in 19th century London. And it looks at the Great Stink of London, which was this episode where the Thames started to stink. It was a very dry summer and the Thames started to stink in this horrific way. It caused the city to empty out. And it eventually led to a total transformation of the sewerage institutions in London. The way that people dealt with human waste was fundamentally remade. So the question I asked there is, how do you go from smell to the transformation of sewers and the embankment of the Thames and all of these things? And the answer went through these similar kinds of processes of trying to think about the ways in which people interacted in situations and brought to bear codes that connected smell to danger using the prevailing miasma theory of disease. So it's a way that cultural codes structured social situations, again, closing that loop that I was describing earlier. I'll skip over Meaning on the Move. That's a more recent one that tries to look at the ways in which it tries to, in a very detailed way, to draw lines between specific interactions in the ways in which those become agglomerated into things that we can identify as broader cultural structures, and tries to specifically trace those loops between those elements. So, if this question of what do we look at has these two answers, which aren't, we want both of them, but it's not totally clear how to get there. The way that I've been trying to get at that, this is the Clifford Geertz quote that I put in the abstract for the talk, which I think is useful for thinking about this. So Geertz talks about, if we want to grasp what people are up to, this is from his essay, Thick Description. If we want to grasp what people are up to, We need a familiarity with the imaginative universe within which their acts are signs. And I find this to be really generative to think about because it interweaves those two levels, right? The level of the situation, the interaction, the way that people are actually speaking, the speech acts that they engage in, the performances, all at a very concrete level of analysis. If we want to understand those things, we need to connect it to this broader set of questions that in structural hermeneutics, cultural sociology, we usually think of as cultural structures, which Geertz more evocatively talks about as this broader imaginative universe, in which their acts become signs, right? Because part of the problem is that with these two elements, right, if we talk about a situation, so say two people interacting around the smell of the Thames, right? We can talk about the situation, but if we want to really understand the social meanings that determine why a particular lord is speaking about this in the House of Lords in a particular way, it's really difficult to interpret that situation without a broader understanding of the semiotic codes that correlate danger and smell in this really profound and frightening way. And so both of these things end up being needed for that kind of interpretation, and similar observations around piracy trials. So this is the kind of, the loop, the version of the hermeneutic circle that I think operates in this method. And, this is a kind of I am aware and know that there are different ideas about what is involved in a hermeneutic circle. I guess I use the kind of basic, Schleiermacher and Bach version, which is relating parts to wholes, right? Or instances to these broader structural observations. So thinking about specific situations as a part, as an instance, and then relating that, using that to develop understandings and ideas about the broader cultural systems, right? As a cultural sociologist, it helps to narrow down what we're looking for at that structural level, right? We're looking for cultural structures like, sign systems or semiotic codes and things of that nature, depending on the analytical questions we're asking. And then we use those things to uncover new cases and to further interpret and understand what's happening, hopefully continuing in that sort of iterative loop as we go. Let's see, so I can either take 2 minutes to wrap up, or I can take 5 minutes to talk through one more piracy case. 2 minutes to wrap up, okay. Perfect. Okay, so in the book on, I've written a couple of things about piracy. The most recent thing is my book on the topic. So there's the cover of it, The Punishment of Pirates. I try to use this method in multiple different cases to try to develop an understanding of a variety of different questions. And many of them are not answerable unless my claim is we can't answer them, we can't understand them properly unless we look at both of these contexts. And so a lot of the book uses data like piracy trials, but also other kinds of interactions, depositions, lawsuits, insurance records, things like that, to try to get these close, specific, individual observations that themselves don't tell us about these broader structural transformations of the semiotic structures that allow for the British Empire to develop a system to classify pirates. And at the heart of the book, that's the kind of big story, is about how the need to classify pirates was essential in order to produce violence against piracy in this consistent way that allowed for piracy to be brought from this significant threat to the emerging structure of the British Empire around the turn of the 18th century, and ultimately allowed that to be brought under control. So from the small to the large and back again in this constant circle, examining culture and how it operates in this case. Okay, thank you very much.